Hello, everybody, and welcome to tonight's event in conversation with Ian Lucas on his new book, Digital Gangsters. I'm Hardeep Matharu. I'm the editor of Byline Times, which I hope some of you will have heard of. We're a new independent investigative fearless daily news site, a monthly print edition newspaper. We are also proud to be running Byline Books, which has been the publisher of Digital Gangsters. So tonight we're here to hear from Ian Lucas. Ian spent 18 years in Parliament as the MP, the Labour MP for Wrexham. And during that time, he sat on the influential Digital Culture, Media and Sport Committee and was part of its seminal inquiry into disinformation and fake news. And among other things, one of its key findings was that there is evidence worthy of investigation around the 2016 EU referendum with regards to potential interference in our democracy. Digital Gangsters is the inside account that he left Parliament to write. It looks at lies and big tech, how that has led to populism and fueled more divisions, and how ultimately it has broken democracy, not just here in the UK, but also in America and elsewhere. I'm really glad that we're doing this talk today, and I'm thrilled that Digital Gangsters is out. I think it's, if ever there was a time to be understanding what it is to have interference in our democratic processes, how that's connected to big tech, the impact on us all as individuals, and where that can ultimately lead. And we're seeing some of the consequences of where that can lead to horrific extent now in Ukraine. If ever there was a time to discuss these issues, it is now. I'm also really pleased that we're going to be hearing from Ian and that he has released Digital Gangsters with Byline Books. I remember having a conversation with him just as he was leaving Parliament after all those years. And he raised the point that although he had done so much good work on the DCMS committee, he still didn't feel that it was gaining the traction that it should have been and that people were interested enough. And by that, he meant elements of the more established
DCMS committee, which I was proudly a member of. And at that time, I was determined that I was going to write about what I thought was a massively important issue of the threats to our democracy that I had discovered for myself, really since the period since 2015. And I think for me, the story started around the 2015 general election with two separate threads. One was that I noticed, even in North Wales, in Wrexham, and in the seats nearby, there was evidence of some huge overseas linked donations that were happening to local Conservative parties in marginal seats in connection with the election by individuals. And this was all recorded on the House of Commons Register of Members' Interests. So it was almost in plain sight, which puzzled me because they were made by individuals. It was Alexander Tomeko, who I didn't know anything about. I'd never come across in terms of anyone being involved locally in either industry or politics in the area. But these names, making substantial donations, were beginning to turn up. And at the same time, in the 2015 general election, and I think fought I think that was around the sixth campaign that I'd fought, either as an activist or an MP at that time. I noticed for the first time that in that election, there was a massive impact by social media campaigning. I had a candidate locally who appeared very shortly before the general election, but was able, through the use of social media and Facebook in particular, to get very substantial recognition on the doorstep, simply from social media campaigning in a way that was completely unprecedented. And I've been campaigning myself since the 1980s. So those two threads were in my mind and encouraged me to join the DCMS committee. And the DCMS committee then began to focus on fake news, which was a huge topic around that time, again around the election of Donald Trump, where again we had this issue of overseas interference becoming very prominent. And of course in the United States, following the investigations made by the Mueller Commission, really the fact of Russian interference is uncontroversial. It was established by the Mueller Commission. And one of the things that was extraordinary about what was happening in the UK was that we had a government that was very aware of Russian interference in the United States, and was also aware, of course, of Russian activity in the Ukraine with the invasion that took place in 2014. And then subsequently, we even had the Skripal attacks in 2018. And yet, the government was very, very resistant to actually investigating Russian or any overseas interference in the UK elections that had taken place from 2014 with the referendum in Scotland through 2015, the general election, 2016, the Brexit vote, and then 2017, the general election. So we had this huge resistance by the government to any investigation into our democracy. So I was an individual who wasn't particularly familiar with tech, and the book is really an attempt on my part to write an account for the general reader, for someone who is interested in politics but is not a tech person, to understand what is actually happening and what did happen over the past 5 years. And this was something that I discovered through my work on the committee and was a revelation to me. And I was a member of Parliament. My job depended on knowledge of the political system and the way it was working. And what really became clear to me was that I had not understood the way that those elections had been fought, and the tools and weapons that had been used in those elections to secure what were generally very unexpected election results during that period. And we then learned through the committee of the importance of social media campaigning, which is continuing as we speak in local elections now in the UK. And I hope the book will explain how this is really a seismic change in politics in this country. I come from a very humble background, to use a slightly hackneyed word, but my father was a manual worker. I was the first in my generation to go to university. And I've had lots of conversations with US politicians who are stunned that I used to spend so little on election campaigns. And I explained that this, and I was quite proud of the fact that anybody from a relatively ordinary background could go into British politics because we didn't have the level of TV advertising spend that they have in the United States. That is now completely changed because we have unlimited spending on online campaigning between elections in the United Kingdom. And that spending is going on as we speak. This is an issue which is hugely important because of two aspects. Firstly, it means that money is much more important in British politics than it's ever been, even in my lifetime. And secondly, the source of that money is hugely important, because one of the threads that I began to pull was the lack of power we have as British politicians to know where the money is coming from that is being used in our political system. And this is really where we are today, where the issue of overseas interference in the past weeks and months has again come to the fore because of what's happening in Ukraine at the moment and the actions of Russian individuals who've been linked to British politics over the past few years. So I hope the book will explain to those who are interested what is happening today in British politics in a way that is entirely comprehensible, I hope, to the reader. And it's a call to arms and to action, because what's very clear is that the government's resistance to actually changing the law and taking the steps that are necessary to deal with digital election campaigning have not been taken. Because for this government, the present system has worked well for them. They're in power, they've achieved a substantial majority, Brexit has been secured through using the flawed, the corrupted system that I believe it is that we have today. We desperately need to change the law. And that is something that not just me, but a lot of independent bodies like the Electoral Commission, the Information Commissioner has been calling for many years, but it's not happening at the present time. And I hope my book is going to contribute to a general knowledge amongst the population of what the present situation is and why it is so important that we make the changes that are necessary in the law to safeguard our democracy.
And that's really, really informative as a starting point. So there's a few strands coming together, all of which you explore. We got donations to political parties and how they're funded, especially during elections. We've got the role of social media. And then we've got a resurgence of populist politics in which, politicians wish to mislead around sort of divisive causes, just because it's not discussed hardly anywhere else within the more mainstream media. Could you dig down a little bit into the EU referendum of 2016? It seems like something no one wants to touch, no one wants to even sort of contemplate, whether it's in the political or the media class. But just how did these strands converge around the referendum, and what sort of links were there to Russian interference?
Well, the first thing to say is that at the time that the referendum happened, I, like most members of parliament, I think, were not aware of the way that the campaign was being fought, and that the use of social media was so important to the campaigns that were being fought at the time. Particularly, I learned because of the work that I was doing on the DCMS committee, because of the work that was done by Vote Leave. And also by Leave EU. And it was one of the things that was interesting when I was working on the book was looking at the evidence that was given, for example, by Aaron Banks about his use of social media and the importance that he placed on the use of social media on his Leave campaign. Also, in the book, there's detailed reference to documentation that Dominic Cummings supplied to the Electoral Commission when Vote Leave was being investigated for committing offences in the campaign. And there's a lot of reference and detail relating to emails that were sent by Cummings himself and other members of the Vote Leave campaign that show the importance that they placed in the last few days, and I'm literally talking the last 48 hours, 72 hours of the campaign, of the spend that had to go into Facebook campaigning at that particular time. So the Leave campaigns, the official campaign, the Vote Leave campaign and Leave EU were placing massive importance on the social media campaign. Of all of the ways that they could spend the substantial money that they had, then they chose to spend it on Facebook and on hitting their particular targets. And whenever anyone says, "Oh, it doesn't make any difference to the campaign," I refer them back to the steps that were actually taken by the choices that were made by the Leave campaign itself. Now, the other area in terms of overseas funding is intensely frustrating is that the Electoral Commission did a very, very detailed and full investigation into funding and referred matters to the police. That was in connection to Leave EU. And the Metropolitan Police carried out an investigation which did not made a decision ultimately not to prosecute. We know very little about what steps were taken by the Metropolitan Police in connection with that particular investigation, and we know very little about the source of the funding that was used in the campaign. But as far as the Leave EU campaign is concerned, we do know from the evidence that Aaron Banks gave to the committee that they met on a number of occasions with the Russian ambassador in the period immediately leading up to the referendum campaign. And I think, and I'm summarising what Banks said to me, but he said, I would not have been meeting the Russian ambassador if it had not been for the Leave campaign. And it is perfectly clear that there was a relationship, but before the campaign, the referendum campaign, between Banks and the Russian embassy, and after the campaign. And when we look at what is happening today about the way that Russia is behaving, and when we look at the importance of that referendum to British politics, we really need to ask ourselves, why have we not carried out an investigation into the detail of that relationship to establish what exactly was going on? Because the resources that we had as a select committee of the House of Commons were very, very limited. We couldn't force people to give evidence. Dominic Cummings has still always refused to give evidence to us about his involvement with the Vote Leave campaign, and was protected by the Prime Minister, which is another area that I go into in the book. But given the seriousness of the present world situation, the fact that Russia actually attacked, with the Skripal attacks, British citizens in the UK, it is incredible that we have not investigated the detail of what Russia has been doing in the UK since 2014, since 2015. And I mean, my personal conclusion is that the reason we haven't investigated this is because the government, and the government we've had since 2015, has not wanted to know, or the public to know, what has been going on.
And indeed, that was the conclusion, wasn't it, of the Intelligence and Security Committee, chaired by Conservative MPs. Their conclusion in this infamous Russia report was, we don't know the extent of Russian interference in British democracy because our security services have not been tasked with looking at it. Ian, we're just going to go now. So people have got their questions coming in. So I'm going to pose a few of those to you. We just picking up on your last point, Sarah Cowley is asking, why were the Conservatives, and particularly Theresa May and Boris Johnson, extremely reluctant to investigate Russian interference in our democracy? So you've touched on they weren't keen to dig down into it. What are some of the reasons for that, do you think?
Well, I think the straight answer is that they did not want to have any conclusions that might undermine the Leave vote in the 2016 referendum. It's really as simple as that. I think Theresa May was in a situation where she was under so much political pressure after the 2017 general election, and was so weak as a Prime Minister at that time, that despite what might have been her personal wish, given her security background at the Home Office and all of that, she did not really want to start lifting the stones to see what was underneath. And I think the fear was that from the government's point of view, that they would see that there had been some sort of investigation. And I hope the evidence is there. I mean, on the Select Committee, we concluded that there was definitely Russian activity going on. Remember, in the United States, as I mentioned earlier, the Mueller Commission, was completely clear, and this is a non-partisan view in America, that there have been interference. So it's not as if I or anyone else is suggesting something that is completely off the wall here.
Even Boris Johnson himself. I think even Boris Johnson himself, Ian, we were exchanging little tweets on Twitter the other day. He's on camera saying, I haven't seen any successful attempts
yes.
at Russian interference. David Blackman is asking, should Parliament's Intelligence and Security Committee actually be tasked with investigating Russian interference again in the wake of the Ukraine invasion? Do we need a second Russia report? Do you think, one, that is needed, and do you think that that is foreseeable given, the government stance?
I think we definitely need an investigation into Russian activity throughout, really, since 2014. I would suggest whether the Intelligence and Security Committee is the right body to do that. I don't know. I'd like a more open investigation, but I think that the prospect of this government opening up such an investigation is virtually non-existent, for the very reason that I've just referred to. They don't want to reopen this as an issue. And one of the frustrating aspects of all of this is that of course the Labour Party is now in a position where they're very reluctant to reopen the whole referendum question. But throughout, really, I've been desperately trying to say this is about democracy and is more fundamental even than the Brexit vote, which I know is of massive importance to the country. But if we're talking about other countries getting involved in our system in this way, we need to take steps to stop that from happening. And the first thing, obviously, is to find out what's happened in the past in order to block off the routes that have been followed before.
And just on that point, in terms of this not being scrutinized, 2014 was the invasion of Crimea, Donbass. As you said, we had the Skripal poisonings. Years before that, we had Alexander Litvinenko. So we've had this sort of whole problem of Russian interference. And then obviously Brexit came, and that's sort of being used as a pivotal moment that we cannot sort of question, because it's the will of the people, and anything around that in some way is an attempt to debase it. But just putting on the strands of opposition MPs and parties and the media. So obviously the government hasn't been very interested in looking into all of this. What do you think are the reasons for the opposition and the media? Is it purely that, Brexit is the will of the people and we can't question it, or are there some other elements at play?
I think that really this is where we go back to the whole social media world in which we're now operating. And the fact that we have two entrenched camps who are arguing around the Brexit issue. Particularly those who feel very strongly about their positions, and the people who are in the Brexit camp will not countenance any suggestion that the vote could not be a valid vote. And even when there may be overwhelming evidence of overseas interference, they find it very difficult to accept that the vote could be questioned. So it's really those people that I would like to somehow reach with my book. Now, that may be a forlorn hope, but I came to this as a member of Parliament myself, who voted, for Article 50, who voted to commence the Brexit process because of the referendum that happened, and I ultimately, I say at one point in the book, I felt a fool. Because 2 years after the vote, and it was over 2 years after the vote happened, the Electoral Commission found that the law had been broken, that spending limits had been broken by the Leave campaign. Now, if I, as a member of Parliament, did that, broke the spending limits in my campaign, I would be disqualified. I would lose my seat. And it's a hugely important step. It's not a minor issue, but the political train had moved on in those 2 years. So it was hugely difficult at that point to even get coverage of that as an issue. And that was a massive issue when it happened, and it didn't get the attention that it ought to have done in 2018. So I think we need to try to pull this back to being a story about the validity of our democracy. And I think the way to do that is to say that this is still happening, because there is a huge amount of money being spent in our politics now. And there are figures that I can quote you. For example, the Metro Mayor of Birmingham, Andy Street, has spent £104,000 on Facebook advertising alone since November of 2018 in campaigns. Now, where that money comes from, I don't know. But these are issues that are out there in the public domain. I got that information from Facebook myself, from their advert site that they've introduced as a result of the pressure that we put them under on the committee. But these are big issues. We've just had an elections bill that's gone through the House of Commons that barely refers to any of this. And it's quite extraordinary that we're allowing this to continue. And that's not only down to politicians, it's also down to our press and the coverage that we're getting there.
So Peter Packham's question is, how do we get the general public convinced that this is an issue that needs to be investigated because it goes to the heart of our democratic process, and that it can't simply be dismissed as conspiracy theories? I mean, and we know from our chats and our talk on this, Ian, Peter Jukes, the executive editor of Byline Times, Carol Cadwallader, any number of the small band of people who've tried to raise awareness of this, certainly have been dismissed in disparaging terms as sort of, advancing conspiracy theories, tinfoil hats. How do we start to tackle that when it's so easy? As you say, we're so polarized and there are such entrenched camps, where it's so easy for the other side, as it were, to just so easily dismiss this as, these are ridiculous claims. That could never happen to British democracy.
Well, what I tried to do when I wrote the book was explain that, I came from a place, I represented a Leave voting constituency in Wrexham, which voted 59 to 41 to leave. And I was desperately trying to pull the constituency together from the referendum vote. The general election campaign was fought in the middle of that period to hold the community together and trying to get people to accommodate each other's opinions. And I think one of the really difficult issues with social media is that it is a very divisive device. It's a very divisive binary forum within which to have the type of conversation that we're having now. So we need also to think about whether we really want politics to be carried out on social media in this way. Because strangely, although a lot of the campaigns that you will be that are taking place up and down the country now will be fought on social media lines, virtually none of it is regulated in the way that most local election campaigns have been strictly regulated throughout our democratic history. It's
on that note,
extraordinary.
On that note, Ian, I'll just bring in Adam M's question, which is, does social media need general regulation, or should it be something that applies just to political campaign periods? And I guess I'll ask as well, what do you think of the online safety bill, which is supposed to be dealing with some of these questions in the UK?
Well, I think the online safety bill largely doesn't deal with elections. And that's, again, a deliberate decision that's been made by the government. So they left this to one side. They've had an elections bill that didn't really address the online media world. I think that the whole concept that we used to have of a short election campaign of 5 weeks before an election, or 6 weeks, and then a period between elections doesn't exist anymore. We have a perpetual campaign that's happening the whole time, and every time there is a political event nowadays, social media advertising is bombarded out along the airwaves, on the platforms, and of course this is not just as I got. One of the important things to understand is that this is not like on television, where everybody sees what's being put out there. This is targeted campaigning. So only some people are seeing the campaigns. Only particular viewpoints are being reached. So there are groups of people who are having their views reinforced by advertising. There are groups of people who are being reached in order to try to persuade them. But this is going on the whole time. So the whole idea that we have a set of rules for a shorter period and a set of rules for a longer period, I think is redundant. I think we need to have financial limits on campaigns the whole time. And we need to know how much is spent the whole time. And we need to know where the money's coming from. Because at the moment, we don't know that. The rules at the moment, actually, the parliamentary rules sometimes give us more information about where the money is coming from, but no information about where the money is spent. You've seen in the news a £100,000 donation to Priti Patel, which was in the news, I think, last week. We don't know what that money is being spent on. And we've got no device, extraordinarily, to know what the Home Secretary is doing with £100,000 of money that's been given to her by somebody. So the whole system is a mess at the moment and was devised and written for a world that no longer exists and for campaigns that are no longer fought.
So we have a question from Andrew Hadley, which is quite philosophical, really, Ian, for you to tackle. Is democracy simply an illusion? What do you say to that?
Well, I hope it isn't. I understand where the questioner is coming from, because I think when I talked about the siloed politics that we're seeing, the idea that democracy is a forum where we all meet together, we discuss the different approaches that we want to take to devise a better society, then we choose between the different routes to reach a conclusion. I think that is not effectively operating in our present system. And what we need to do is to devise a system that tries as best we can to bring that back. I think was it Churchill who said democracy was the worst political system, but it was better than all the others, or something, or a bad political system, but better than all the others. I think we need to really see where we are, see how elections are being fought, and reassess the way that arguments are being advanced to voters. We need the same arguments advanced to different to the whole of the electorate, and openly. There are a lot of closed WhatsApp groups. There are a lot of closed Facebook groups. And again, I talk a bit more in the book about all this. And these are the types of quite detailed areas that I hope when I explain them in the book become more comprehensible to the general voter, because a lot of this information is quite difficult to see until it's gradually revealed. And that's what happened with me. I didn't understand the way the system was working, and my job depended on it. So I can well understand why people are confused and think that all of this is smoke and mirrors. But it really is very, very important, because the way that we have operated as a democracy, I genuinely believe is under real threat.
Do you think that to an extent this is going to come down to also educating people around social media and what they're getting into it? The sort of famous phrase about if it's free, you're the product, which Carl Taylor explores in his little black book of Data and Democracy, which we've also published. How do you think, the average person on the street would view technology and its role in their everyday lives? And do you think that they would even register that actually it can have quite a malign influence on the very sort of political system they're living in?
Well, when I came to when I came to question Facebook executives for the first time in 2018, I had a broadly positive view of Facebook personally. And it's only through the course of the work that I've been doing since then that my position has completely changed. And I think that a lot of people generally see it as a tool to connect, which is a good thing. And that's the position that they're starting in, but they're not aware of the malign influence. They're aware of some of the malign influences on children and so on, but a lot of the malign influences that have been revealed on democracy, for example, I think people don't understand. So I do think there's a huge educational project that needs to go on. I do think that people need to be much more conscious of the way they're used in social media, and they need to be much more questioning about the messages that they're receiving as well. So all of this is difficult, but I think it's not insurmountable. And I think we do need a framework within which to operate, which is much more aligned to the system that's actually working now. Because if we don't have a regulatory framework, then the present system is going to continue, and it's going to make the situation more worse rather than in any sense improve. And I think that's a real threat again.
So we have two questions. One from Sarah Cowley, who asks, do the Conservatives actually want Russian interference in our elections? And Elizabeth Sherritt is asking, couldn't GCHQ, a section of that, at least be monitoring, election interference on social media? I mean, I don't know if they do, but the Russia report, as we touched on earlier, said that
they do. I think they already do that.
Yeah, they don't do that. Wow.
Well, no, I think they do that. I think
they do that.
Yeah, I think there's already evidence of social media interference in, from Russia. And I suspect our security services know a lot about this that isn't in the public domain. I think that the Intelligence and Security Committee, I'm sure, has had more briefing on this than we know about. Now, I'm sure we have the capacity to do this, but I'm not sure we certainly haven't had the political will in the last few years. And, I've been questioning about Russian interference for a number of years. And as you mentioned earlier, we've had this ludicrous distinction between successful and unsuccessful Russian interference. Whether the government, I think there are people within the Conservative Party who definitely do not want Russian interference in the UK political system. But I think that money has rolled in, not just to politics in Britain, but to Britain generally. I mean, anyone who's read Catherine Belton's book can see that in the stories that she tells about the way that Russian oligarchs have had a huge influence. But the position is so complex because obviously not everyone in Russia holds the same political opinions. They come from different viewpoints. They have different motivations. But at the moment, it just seems to be open season. And we're not really putting up any sort of detailed assessment of what is going on with our politics, why people are making these donations. I mean, if someone came to me, I was a member of Parliament for 18 years, as you said. If someone came to me and offered me £100,000, and let's be clear, this hasn't just happened in the Conservative Party, I would be asking, why do you want to give me this money? And do you want anything in return? I didn't go into politics to have that sort of relationship with any voters. And we need to go back to a system where we're much more open in the way that politics is conducted, because otherwise our whole system is going to collapse and be brought into disrepute.
And in recent years, in particular, Ian, we've seen attacks on our democratic system. We're talking about electoral interference, but we've all seen Boris Johnson's government break norms and not stick to the rules like no administration before it. I guess the final question is, why do you think in Britain we're so complacent with regards to democracy, and we don't see the cumulative effect of things like Brexit, Russian interference, London grad, all of Russian money being stored here, the Conservative Party and its continuous lies on various issues? Do you think are we just taking for granted something that people in Ukraine are paying with their lives to fight for?
I think we're a very fractured society in Britain at the moment, a very entrenched society, which has many people have very little belief in politics, in the motivations that took me into Parliament to try to make things better. They think that their country is going to get worse before it gets better. And I think that's really the biggest change that I've seen from my generation, from when I was growing up to the generation of my children, when I speak to them about these sorts of issues. And let's be clear, I don't think it's in the just in the United Kingdom. I think it's similar in the United States. But I do think this is something that it's changed for the worse, to my mind, in the last 30 years. I think it can change again. I think things like the passion of the Ukrainian people at the moment should be an example to us to see the value that people place on democracy, and I hope that that may be part of recognizing that we have to have a credible democratic system in order to make progress in our own society. I think the divisiveness that we have in UK society at the moment is the most damaging aspect of our politics at the moment. It's very unfortunate that we have the Prime Minister we have, rather than a figure who actually brings people together. And I think what is required fundamentally is a change in approach and a more inclusive political framework and debating sphere, so that we can again start to be behaving more like a cohesive society, rather than a society made up of camps who are throwing bricks at each other the whole time.
Well, thank you so much, Ian, for joining us all this evening with the insights. I mean, there are so many insights
here all night,
in the book. Yeah, we could be here all night, but we do also want to encourage people to read Digital Gangsters, which is
please do. Yeah. It was
now
a revelation for me, and I think that I hope it will give you a picture of how I found out, what I hope will motivate you to get involved in making our system better.
Yeah, and it certainly seems, as you're saying, it's going to take more and more people to realize and come together and say, actually, this is about restoring our democracy. And the more people we can inform about that, the better. So Digital Gangsters is out now. Thank you to everyone who joined us this evening, and apologies for some problems, it seems, here and there on YouTube and sort of quality of this broadcast. Thank you for your questions. I'll be in conversation with Ian again, actually, in a few weeks' time at Byline Festival, which is taking place in Notting Hill at the end of this month, over 3 days. There are plenty of details on the Byline Festival website. Do come and join us. There'll be lots of other Byline Times writers, and we'll be looking at big tech, democracy, Russian interference, the war in Ukraine, all of these topics with Ian and many others. So if you have been interested in what we've been discussing tonight, please do come along. But as I said, thank you very much, Ian, and thank you all for joining us this evening.